Welcome to Wisdom Beyond Ages, where we unravel stories that echo through time. In the heart of Manhattan, Charles Woodward, a man with unimaginable wealth, stood in his opulent penthouse. The city skyline stretched out before him, a stunning view that mirrored the void in his heart. Despite his financial triumphs, Charles felt trapped in a life lacking meaning, yearning for a legacy. A child to carry his name. Driving through New York's bustling streets in his Lamborghini, a homeless woman caught his eye. Her piercing blue eyes held a mixture of desperation and determination. Initially dismissive, Charles couldn't shake the image of her haunting gaze. Compelled by an unnameable feeling, he turned back. As he approached her again, he offered a chance without explanation. Despite her initial suspicion and his blunt demeanor, something about his sincerity led her to accept. She cautiously slid into the passenger seat, the engine roaring as the car merged into the city's relentless pace. In the silence that followed, Charles glanced at her from the corner of his eye. She appeared young, perhaps 28. But her face bore the marks of someone who had endured more than her years should allow. Breaking the silence with the same dispassionate tone he used in boardrooms, he spoke. "I'm going to make you an offer that will change your life." His voice was calm and measured, as if negotiating another high-stakes deal. "I need a child, not a wife or a relationship, just a child. I'll pay you a fortune and take care of you throughout the pregnancy. Once it's done, you're free to go." Her eyes widened, struggling to comprehend what she had just heard. "A child?" she repeated, disbelief evident in her voice. "You said you wouldn't lay a hand on me," she added cautiously. "Of course not," he replied coolly. "It'll be done through artificial insemination. What else did you think? Anything else would be completely off the table." She fell silent, the city's noise fading into the background as her thoughts spiraled. She reflected on how far her life had fallen, from dreams full of promise to the ruins she faced alone in a foreign land with no family or roots. She felt as though she was drowning in an endless sea of loneliness, a pain she doubted he could understand. Charles, attuned to subtleties, caught her softly murmuring something in French under her breath, words tinged with resignation and a faint glimmer of hope. "You think I don't understand you?" he interrupted, his voice still cold but carrying a trace of curiosity. "I'm a cosmopolitan man. I know what you said, misery has no end." He paused, studying her. "So, is this your way out?" She let out a weary sigh, her shoulders sagging in defeat, and nodded. Reality had caught up with her, leaving her no other choice. Charles continued, his tone still detached. "2 questions. What's your name and what are you running from?" "Antoinette Volée," she answered softly, her voice trembling but retaining a fragile dignity. "I'm French. I came to the U.S. 5 years ago, crossing the Atlantic chasing a dream. Back then I thought leaving France behind would open the door to a better future. But when I got here, this country stripped me of everything, piece by piece. This city devoured my hopes, my dreams, even my sense of self. I've lost it all. The job, the purpose, the reason to keep fighting. Now I roam these streets unseen and aimless." Charles, maintaining his usual calm demeanor, looked at her with the same piercing focus he reserved for negotiating high-stakes deals. Yet something inside him stirred, a small, almost imperceptible spark of an emotion long forgotten. Antoinette held her gaze steady, as if peering into some distant fragment of her past. "What am I trying to run away from?" she said softly, almost as though speaking to herself. "Everything. This shattered life, the empty promises I made to myself, These streets that remind me of my failures with every step I take. I just want to go home to France. Sometimes I dream about its open fields, the scent of chestnut trees, the sound of rain hitting the rooftops of my old town. But here, dreams demand too high a price, and I can't even afford a way back." A heavy silence fell between them, her words cutting through Charles's carefully constructed defenses. This woman, a stranger, stood before him raw and unguarded, speaking truths that pierced his composure. Behind her blue eyes, weathered by life's cruelty, was a pain that mirrored his own loneliness, though hers was far more unforgiving. He inhaled deeply, forcing himself to regain control. His expression hardened, his voice reverting to its usual cold, detached tone. "I understand," he said. He paused, studying her intently before continuing. "I'll ask you only once. Will you accept my proposal? Will you carry my child and then leave? I'll ensure you have more than enough money to return to France and live comfortably." Antoinette's expression shifted, a blend of exhaustion and relief crossing her face. In a fleeting moment, she reflected on every fall she'd taken and every battle she'd lost. Perhaps this deal was her only escape, her one chance to break free from an endless cycle of despair. Lowering her head, she closed her eyes and sighed softly. "Do I even have another choice?" she finally replied, her voice quiet but resolute. "I'll do it." Charles nodded, his movement as precise as closing a stock market deal. "We'll put everything in writing to make it clear," he said. "Since we'll be working together, tell me your name." He hesitated, then added, "And one more thing." She interrupted, her voice steady. "Why would a man like you need something as cold as a loveless agreement like this? Don't you already have everything to make someone fall for you?" For a brief moment, Charles's composed exterior faltered. Her question hit harder than he expected. No one had confronted him so directly before. The hum of his Lamborghini's engine vibrated under his hand as the city's noise faded into the background. His gray eyes met hers, and for a fleeting second a storm of emotions churned within him. Nostalgia, frustration, and perhaps the faintest flicker of vulnerability. Charles took a deliberate breath, pausing as if presenting a game-changing figure in a critical negotiation. "My name is Charles Woodward," he began, his voice calm and controlled. "And yes, you're right about one thing. I have it all: power, wealth, influence. People either respect me or fear me. But love." He let the word linger before continuing. "Love is just another failed contract full of promises no one keeps. I've experienced it twice. 2 marriages, both ending in ruins. They didn't love me. They loved the image, the money, the illusion of status. Falling for someone at my level," he shook his head with a touch of sarcasm, "I've tried that before. Twice. Love is just a deal disguised as emotion. I won't do it again." His tone grew colder. "I don't need a wife who stays for what I can give her. I won't bear the burden of empty vows or endure another broken relationship. My only concern now is my successor." As he spoke, his focus sharpened, his commanding presence returning. The young woman beside him, unfazed, spoke with surprising sincerity. "Your words are as calculated as you are, Charles," she said calmly but honestly, catching him off guard. "But I see more than calculation. Beneath all that control, there's someone who isn't just afraid of love but secretly yearns for it. Loneliness can masquerade as strength, but it always reveals itself in the end." Charles didn't respond. Instead, he turned his attention forward, started the car, and let the engine's low growl fill the silence. He drove wordlessly toward his Upper East Side estate, a fortress of marble and steel, grand yet devoid of warmth, much like its owner. When they arrived, Charles parked in the underground garage. Still silent, he exited the car, his expression unreadable. Antoinette stepped out, her gaze drawn to the towering structure before her, a stark reminder of how far removed this world was from her own. Charles glanced at her briefly, noting the contrast between her worn clothing and his pristine Lamborghini. Without emotion, he said, "Come inside." He led her into the opulent interior. The stark white marble walls, sweeping staircase, and priceless art pieces gave it the feel of a museum rather than a home. Beautiful, yet cold and intimidating. Charles gestured to a middle-aged woman who appeared as they entered. "Stephanie," he said firmly. "Make sure she's taken care of. Clothes." "Make sure she's comfortable, Stephanie," Charles instructed, his voice cool. "Provide her with clothes, a bath, and food, and keep this to yourself." Stephanie nodded, her warm smile contrasting with his detached demeanor. She turned to Antoinette with kindness. "Let's get you settled," she said, guiding her down a hallway to a guest room. Antoinette followed silently, overwhelmed by the surreal world she had entered, knowing this moment would change her life forever. Hours later, Charles was immersed in work in his office, a space that radiated power and intellect. Leather-bound books lined the walls, and large windows offered a sweeping view of Manhattan. Behind a dark wooden desk, he meticulously reviewed documents while his lawyer, Tom Francis, examined a contract. The silence was interrupted by a knock. "Come in," Charles said, eyes still on his papers. His housekeeper, Elizabeth, entered calmly. "Mr. Woodward, you called for me?" she asked. "Yes, Elizabeth, bring the young lady down immediately," he replied. Elizabeth exited with quiet efficiency, leaving the room heavy with anticipation. Minutes passed in silence until another knock broke the tension. "Come in," Charles repeated flatly. The door opened and Antoinette stood transformed. The once frail woman now radiated an almost ethereal presence. Her hair, now in soft waves, gleamed like spun gold, and her blue eyes sparkled with vibrant clarity. She carried herself with newfound confidence, her posture poised, her simple yet elegant outfit flattering her figure. Tom Francis stared, momentarily speechless. "Miss, you look absolutely stunning," he murmured. Antoinette, taken aback by the compliment, blushed but quickly regained her composure. Charles felt a strange, unwelcome pang within him, jealousy, sharp and unfamiliar. Masking his discomfort, he turned to Tom with a sharp tone. "Let's get back to reviewing the contract terms," he said, spreading the document across the desk. The room remained tense, charged with unspoken emotions. In the end, the contract was signed, binding them to terms that would change their lives. The next morning, Charles rose early, his mind weighed down by unshakable thoughts. The sunrise painted the sky in hues of pink and gold, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The contract loomed large as he walked toward Antoinette's wing, his footsteps echoing through the silent house. He knocked softly on her door, then opened it decisively. "We're leaving now," he announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. Antoinette, still groggy, looked at him in confusion. "Where are we going?" she asked, rubbing her eyes as sunlight filled the room. "To fulfill the first clause of the agreement," he replied tersely. Minutes later, they were in his Lamborghini, the engine roaring to life as he drove in silence. Antoinette stared out the window, processing the whirlwind of events. Antoinette gazed out the window, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't articulate. Sometimes silence speaks volumes. And soon the car stopped outside one of New York's most prestigious fertility clinics. The sleek building with its polished silver sign exuded exclusivity, a place known only to the elite. Antoinette stepped out, her eyes fixed on the imposing structure. She realized bringing a new life into the world is never just a transaction, no matter how it starts. This life would be cherished. It wasn't just a contract, but the beginning of something deeper. Charles, ever stoic, walked beside her, appearing indifferent. Together they entered the clinic, where pristine white walls seemed designed to erase doubt. Yet inside, Antoinette's mind raced with questions and emotions. The hardest steps are often taken in quiet resignation. The medical staff greeted them with professionalism, their explanations precise and devoid of emotion. The process was swift yet complex, filled with consultations, tests, and reviews, each adding weight to their agreement. Some promises aren't just written, they live within us, shaping who we are. Antoinette understood this wasn't just a legal obligation, it was a profound responsibility. When the day of insemination arrived, the procedure was clinical and detached, much like everything Charles orchestrated. Yet in the sterile environment, Antoinette felt something stir. This wasn't just an arrangement, it was the start of a journey no contract could fully capture. Despite the clinic's chill, warmth swelled in her heart. While the medical team worked, her thoughts wandered to the life she now carried. This was more than a medical procedure. It felt sacred. Staring at the plain white ceiling, her mind leapt into the future. A lump rose in her throat as she closed her eyes, her inner voice whispering truths she couldn't ignore. This was a life she would cherish with all her heart. Placing a hand on her abdomen, she felt a bond forming, not born of agreements, but something far more profound. On the drive home, the silence was suffocating. Antoinette watched the city lights blur into streaks of gold and shadow. Finally, Charles spoke, his voice detached. "This is just the beginning. Now we wait," he said, his tone cold, finalizing a transaction rather than embracing something extraordinary. Antoinette glanced at him uneasily, unsettled by his pragmatic approach. To him, today's events seemed just another item on his to-do list. Taking a steadying breath, she spoke calmly, her voice tinged with emotion. "Children aren't just the result of desire or a well-made plan," she said, looking straight ahead. "They are pieces of our souls, the legacy we leave behind. Today, we didn't just fulfill a clause, we ignited a spark no contract could extinguish, a spark born of life, not wealth or paperwork." Her words struck Charles unexpectedly, cutting through his detached exterior. For the first time, something in her voice reached him, stirring long-buried emotions. A chill crept over him as he pulled the car to a stop on a quiet street, turning to look at her. His expression was unreadable, yet his eyes lingered on her, as though seeing her for the first time. "What do you really know about the soul?" he asked softly, his voice betraying vulnerability. Antoinette met his gaze, steady and unwavering, her tone laced with quiet wisdom. "The soul isn't something you can buy, Charles. No contract or amount of money can truly claim it. Love, whether acknowledged or not, finds its way into the things we create." Her words lingered, resonating in a part of Charles he had long ignored. A forgotten feeling stirred, sending chills up his spine. For once, Charles, who controlled every aspect of his life like a flawless business venture, found himself speechless. Since the procedure, their conversations had been minimal, limited to necessity, yet both could feel something larger unfolding, like a river carrying them toward an unseen destination. Destiny flows in its own way, impossible to predict. The fertility clinic awaited them again, Yet this time with an air of expectation neither could ignore. The silence in the car was heavier now, as if both understood that what they were about to hear could change everything. Charles drove, his face unreadable, though a storm of anticipation brewed inside him. Antoinette sat quietly, her hands folded, outwardly calm, but inwardly caught in a whirlwind of emotion. The medical staff greeted them with professionalism, making even the most life-altering moments feel routine. A sign on the wall caught Antoinette's eye. Creation is a divine act, a whispered breath of the universe. The gynecologist, a composed man with kind eyes, ushered them into a private room. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Woodward," he said warmly. "Today we'll determine if the procedure was successful." As Antoinette settled onto the examination table, her heart pounded. This wasn't just a medical appointment, it felt like stepping into the unknown. Charles uncharacteristically reached out and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. His touch was soft, almost tender, revealing a flicker of something more human beneath his usual reserve. "The heart," Antoinette said softly, "recognizes life's echo. When it senses new beginnings, it can't help but beat faster." Her words, rich with wisdom, left Charles momentarily at a loss. The doctor prepared the ultrasound, and the room fell into a deep, expectant silence. As the cold gel touched her abdomen, the first faint sound of a heartbeat filled the air. Everyone froze. The gynecologist smiled and turned to them. "Life doesn't announce itself with fanfare," he said gently. "It begins with a steady, eternal rhythm." After a pause that felt like an eternity, he added, "And in this case, it's not just one rhythm, it's 3. Congratulations, you're expecting triplets." Time seemed to stand still. Antoinette's breath caught, her eyes filling with tears. 3 tiny hearts were beating in perfect harmony inside her. Charles, overcome by an emotion he couldn't name, leaned forward and kissed her forehead, a rare, tender gesture. Antoinette instinctively placed her hands on her stomach, her thoughts consumed by the 3 lives growing within her. In that moment, they both realized that love isn't confined by agreements or logic. It's boundless, overflowing, and unstoppable. It transforms everything it touches. Not even destiny could predict this moment. Charles stood at the doorway, his gaze on her softer now, carrying an openness that hadn't been there before. Something inside him seemed to thaw as he realized the woman before him wasn't merely carrying his air. She was part of a shared miracle, something far greater than either of them alone. Charles, a man unaccustomed to letting anyone in, felt an unfamiliar shift deep within. It was 3 months after the procedure that afternoon. He stood silently in the living room doorway, watching Antoinette sitting out on the terrace. The setting sun wrapped her in a golden glow as she stared toward the horizon, her expression unusually serene. Antoinette, showing the first signs of her pregnancy, brought a hand to her temple and closed her eyes. Charles frowned slightly, concern crossing his face. She had always seemed unshakable, even through the cold, practical arrangement they had made. But now, for the first time, she appeared vulnerable. Something stirred in him, a quiet instinct he hadn't known he had. Charles walked toward her. Charles approached her with steady purpose. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, but still restrained. Antoinette opened her eyes, looking at him with calm surprise. "Just a little dizzy. I think it's normal," she said, offering a faint smile as if to brush it off. Charles hesitated. Normally he would have called for a staff member, but this time he acted differently. Without a second thought, he gently lifted her into his arms. For a man so guarded, The tenderness in his movements surprised even him. Startled, Antoinette looked up at him. "Charles, you don't have to. I can walk," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "No," he replied firmly, though with unusual softness. "Let me." The walk from the terrace to her room was quiet, but the silence felt meaningful. Every step Charles took seemed to carry the weight of his transformation. As he held her, he became aware of not just her lightness, but the heavy shift happening within him. When they reached her door, he nudged it open with his foot and carried her across the threshold. Antoinette's body tensed slightly, her eyes widening in astonishment. The room had been transformed. Every detail spoke of the new lives they were preparing to welcome. The scent of fresh flowers lingered, and a large stuffed animal on the dresser added warmth to the space. "What is this?" Antoinette whispered, her voice barely audible as she took in the thoughtful changes. Charles, normally composed, allowed a flicker of vulnerability to show. "I wanted you to feel comfortable," he said softly. "I thought you might like it." His tone was careful, almost unsure. "I wasn't expecting this," she murmured, overwhelmed by the details. As he helped her settle onto the bed, Charles sat quietly at the edge, watching her. For a moment they said nothing, but the silence carried a depth neither had expected. "Every new life deserves a space filled with light," Charles said finally, surprising even himself. "A place where love can grow." Antoinette turned to him, her gaze intense, sending a shiver down his spine. "Love doesn't ask for anything in return," she said softly, her words deliberate and meaningful, "but it changes everything." Charles looked away briefly, unable to meet her eyes. Something long buried within him was breaking open. The quiet between them deepened, drawing them closer together. For the first time, Charles allowed himself to feel something, a sliver of warmth, a hint of the love he had kept at bay. Their hands intertwined as a soft breeze floated in through the window, carrying with it the promise of change. Both knew they were beginning a journey far deeper than they had ever anticipated. The next morning, Charles woke early, the weight of the day pressing heavily on him. Over the past few weeks, his connection with Antoinette had grown beyond the agreement that had brought them together. Without realizing it, he had begun to care for her deeply. The mansion was eerily still, as if time itself had paused. In the quiet, 3 lives were preparing to make their grand entrance. Charles paced the hallway, his thoughts swirling until her voice called out faintly from behind the door. "Charles, I think it's time," she said, her tone a mix of excitement and nerves. Standing in the doorway, her face glowed despite her exhaustion, illuminated by an inner light. Charles's heart skipped a beat. He rushed to her side, helping her stand as they prepared to leave for the hospital. The engine of the Lamborghini roared to life, but it was nothing compared to the pounding of their hearts. Antoinette, one hand resting on her round belly, glanced at Charles. What had started as a mere transaction now felt like something far deeper. "I'll be right here," Charles said firmly, his voice calm but filled with determination. "I'm not going anywhere." "Thank you," she whispered, her tone filled with gratitude and trust. The drive to the hospital felt like a blur. When they arrived, the staff was ready and waiting. Antoinette was rushed to the delivery room, with Charles by her side, gripping her hand firmly. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as her contractions intensified. "You're doing amazing," he said, his voice steady and reassuring, anchoring them both through this life-changing moment. He watched as she endured the pain of bringing not 1 but 3 lives into the world. Minutes felt like hours until finally the first cry broke the silence. A boy, their son. A lump formed in Charles's throat, something inside him breaking and rebuilding simultaneously. Moments later, a second cry filled the room, another boy, and then the third, a girl. 3 tiny hearts, 3 new lives. Every plan Charles had made seemed suddenly trivial. "They're perfect," Antoinette whispered, her voice weak but filled with awe as she gazed at her newborns. Tears streamed down her face as her trembling hands gently touched their tiny cheeks, overwhelmed by a love she hadn't expected. Equally moved, Charles held her hand tightly, unable to look away from the little lives now cradled by the nurses. For the first time, he felt a connection to something he couldn't buy, control, or predict. Pure, unfiltered life. Yet beneath the joy, he noticed Antoinette's tears carried more than happiness. There was sorrow, too, a pain he was only beginning to understand. She wept for the future, for the relentless terms of their agreement. Soon, she would have to leave these precious little ones she already loved with all her heart. "Charles," she sobbed, her voice breaking, "I don't want to leave them, but this was our deal. I'll honor it, even if it tears me apart." Charles's heart shattered with every word. The joy he had felt moments ago now bore the weight of cold reality. Their arrangement, the rigid terms, and ironclad clauses suddenly felt meaningless in the face of her tears. Without speaking, he leaned down and kissed her forehead as she cried. A lump rose in his throat, a pressure in his chest unlike anything he'd felt before. Something had shifted within him, and there was no going back. Antoinette reached out, her trembling fingers brushing her daughter's soft cheek as tears continued to fall. She couldn't stop them, and neither could Charles. Everything had changed in ways neither of them had expected. At that moment, she realized love, unexpected and profound, could outshine any contract. She didn't know how she would face what was coming, but for now, all she could do was cling to this fleeting moment with the children she had brought into the world, knowing they would soon no longer be hers. Charles stood frozen, silently absorbing her pain, unable to find the words. He knew it couldn't end like this. Something had to change, but he didn't know how. The morning after the delivery, the soft light of dawn streamed through the hospital window, casting a gentle glow across the room. Antoinette rested after a long, grueling night, her peaceful expression reflecting the quiet triumph of bringing 3 lives into the world. Charles, typically distant, had spent the entire night in a chair by her side, watching her as she slept. Though he tried to mask it, the vulnerability etched across her face deeply affected him. As the sun rose, Charles decided to let her sleep a little longer. He quietly slipped out of the room to grab breakfast and pick up a few items to make her more comfortable. When he returned, his footsteps echoed purposefully down the hallway. As he approached Antoinette's room, he froze. The door was slightly ajar, and from the hallway he noticed the room had changed dramatically. Flowers, dozens of vibrant bouquets, filled the space with color. But what stopped him cold was the sight of Tom Francis, his trusted lawyer, sitting in the chair Charles had occupied all night. Something churned inside him as he stood motionless in the doorway. Tom leaned toward Antoinette, speaking softly. Charles overheard words that struck him like a blow. "Antoinette," Tom began, his voice gentle in a way Charles had never heard before. "Everything has happened so quickly, and this might come as a surprise," Tom said, gently taking her hand. "Since I met you, something changed in me. You're extraordinary." His sincerity was undeniable. "What I feel is real. I want to be there for you, to offer you more if you'll let me. I want to ask you something." Antoinette, weakened by childbirth, looked at him with astonishment and confusion. "Tom," she whispered faintly. Charles felt a sharp pang in his chest. The flowers, Tom's tone, the way he held her hand, it was all painfully clear. Tom wasn't there for legal matters. He was in love with her. Tom continued, "Antoinette, I don't want this to be fleeting. I want to give you a home, a life without pressure, without clauses, without contracts, just us." He took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "Antoinette, will you marry me?" He revealed a stunning ring. Charles could no longer hold back. He pushed the door open, startling them. Tom quickly released Antoinette's hand. "Charles," Tom greeted him calmly, "I wasn't expecting you back so soon." Charles approached the bed, his face stoic, eyes intense. He glanced at Antoinette, who looked as shocked as he felt. Her gaze shifted to the flowers, their colors overwhelming. "Tom," Charles said coldly, "those flowers, they're yours, aren't they?" Tom nodded, standing. "Yes, I thought she deserved beauty around her. Don't you agree?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Charles clenched his fists, struggling to maintain composure. "I see you've offered her something else," Charles said, his voice edged with sarcasm. "Marriage, here in the hospital, just after she's given birth?" Tom stood tall, calm. "Yes, Charles. I've offered her something real, not bound by agreements and contracts. That's what she needs, someone who cares about her, not because of an arrangement, but because of who she is." Charles's jaw tightened, feeling powerless. For so long he believed he controlled everything, but now he realized how wrong he had been. Tom's presence was undeniable, his intentions clear. "I don't think this is the moment for emotional decisions," Charles said firmly. "She needs peace, not stress." Tom met his gaze, calm yet defiant. "You're right, Charles. It's not about pressure, but it's not the time to ignore feelings. What I feel for her won't vanish just because you want this to stay a business deal." Antoinette, exhausted, looked at both men. "Tom, Charles," she murmured, raising a hand to her temple. "Please, not now. I just need to rest." Both men paused, realizing the tension had escalated. Tom took one last look at Antoinette before heading for the door. "Rest, Antoinette. I'm here if you need me," he said softly, leaving the room. As the door closed, Charles stood silently by the bed, unsure of what to say. The silence was heavy with unspoken truths. Slowly, Charles sat in the chair next to her, watching as Antoinette closed her eyes, drained by everything. But as she slept, one thing became clear to him. This was no longer just a contract, and that terrified him. Sadness enveloped Antoinette as she faced the inevitable day. The contract was explicit. She had to leave the mansion, her children, and the life she had created. In her room, surrounded by mementos of her baby, she packed a small suitcase with just the essentials. The fortune Charles had promised no longer mattered. As she zipped the suitcase, her heart ached unbearably. Tears flowed as she held each child, kissing their tiny cheeks one last time. The triplets, unaware of their mother's sorrow, slept peacefully. She memorized their angelic faces, delicate fingers, and soft breaths. Signing the contract was meant to secure a future, but she never imagined the cost. "I should have remained a wanderer," she thought bitterly, instead of enduring this heartbreak. Dragging her suitcase, she descended the grand staircase, each step echoing a painful farewell. The once welcoming halls felt cold and distant. As she reached the massive front door, her trembling hand rested on the knob. Taking a deep breath, she prepared to leave for the airport, heading to a place that no longer felt like home. But just as she turned the knob, a voice broke the silence. "Antoinette, where are you going?" Charles called from deep within the house. She froze, not turning around. "It's because of Tom, isn't it?" He pressed, stepping closer. "You're leaving because you love him." Antoinette shut her eyes, emotions swirling with pain and frustration. After a moment, she faced him, her tear-streaked face filled with despair. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't about Tom. It's about the contract. 90 days after the birth, as we agreed." Charles stopped just a few feet away, breathing heavily. But the look in his eyes wasn't just concern, it was fear. Fear of losing her. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the contract that had defined their relationship. Instead of arguing, he did something unexpected. With a surge of emotion, he tore the document into shreds, letting the pieces fall to the floor. Antoinette stared in shock. "I'm sorry, Antoinette," Charles said, his voice breaking as he dropped to his knees. "Do you know what you've taught me? When I said I couldn't love again because I'd been hurt by women who only cared about money, I believed it. But you've shown me something different. It's madness to hate all roses because one thorn pricked you." His voice cracked. "I don't care about the contract or the deal. The only thing that matters is you. Please stay. For the children. For us." Antoinette's expression softened, seeing the raw vulnerability in his eyes. She stepped closer, tears streaming, and gently placed her hand on his head. "Charles," she whispered, her voice breaking, "how could you not see? It's always been you. From the moment you saved me, my heart was yours." Charles looked up, disbelief turning to relief. "I love you, Antoinette," he said softly. "I've loved you all along." Antoinette dropped her suitcase and embraced him. "I love you too, Charles," she whispered, her tears now joyful. He pulled her close, sealing their unspoken words with a deep, heartfelt kiss. Months later, the once quiet mansion was filled with laughter and warmth. Charles and Antoinette's wedding was a celebration of love, surrounded by their triplets, a testament to their journey's transformation. Charles gazed at his family, realizing he hadn't just signed a contract, he had made a lifelong commitment to love. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt tales. Your stories and thoughts mean the world to us. Let's continue building this community together.